Now that we've got some data to work with, it's time for some queries. There are a number of ways to query related data. Eager loading allows you to use the dbset include method to retrieve data and its related data in the same query. You'll learn about other ways in the next few clips of this module. So for now, let's focus on eager loading with include. Here's a query starting with an author's dbset. And in this case, Visual Studio's code completion read my mind correctly. Include is a method of dbset. Include takes a lambda as a parameter to define which navigation or collection property I want to include, and that's going to be the author's books. Don't forget a link execution method at the end. I'll use toList to get all of the authors with their books, but you'll need a using statement for the Microsoft Entity Framework Core namespace. I'm also adding a little logic to output the authors and their books to the console. Once I've run this method, checking out the logs, the first thing we see is that EF Core created a left join query to retrieve the authors and their books. And looking at the output list of authors and books, there are all of the authors and the books for each of the authors who does have a book in the database. Remember when we looked at the query workflow earlier in this course, the last piece of that was that the DB context would connect any related objects that came back from the query. And that's how the author objects knew which books belonged in its collections. By default, include with a navigation collection, such as the books property, brings back all of the items in that collection. But it is possible to filter and even sort that included data. And this capability is a huge deal for people who have been working with EF or EF Core for any amount of time. Filtering and sorting the included data has only been a possibility since EF Core 5. So before I change the query, let's take a peek at the raw data. There's a wide range of published dates. Let's get the books that were published since 2010. Now, back in the code, here's a revised version of my query. And inside the include method, where I've expressed that I want the books included, I'll add a where method to filter down the books that get returned to just those whose published date is greater than or equal to 2010. I can also use the order by method, and I'll do that to sort each author's books by title. When I run this query and look again at the output, first you can see that the SQL is now applying the filter to the select books clause in the left join, and the book title has been added to the order by clause. And in the output, all the authors are still there, but the older books by Rhoda Lerman and Ursula K. Le Guin aren't there anymore. With the authors, the core of the query, you can still do all the things you learned earlier about querying in combination with the include. For example, you can filter on which authors you want and then bring along their books. Or after the include, you can use other link execution methods like first or default. Just remember that include is a method of dbset, so you can't append it to an execution method. An execution method might be returning a list of authors or a single author, and include isn't a method of either of those types. Nor can you use include in combination with find. Remember that just like include, find only works directly on a dbset. There are a variety of ways that you can build graphs with eager loading. You can have multiple levels of includes. For example, if we were tracking the book jacket designs for each book, in my query for the authors, not only can I include the books, but I can drill even further using EF Core's then include method to drill into the books and pull back all of the book jacket objects for the books. So I'm saying get the authors, include the books, then include the book jackets for the books. You can also traverse graphs in multiple directions. For example, I might have a contact info class and be using that as a property in author. So in a single query, I could ask for authors along with the author's books and the author's contact info. In that case, you would compose the query with two include methods because they're both including directly from the author. Include books and include contact info. Another interesting way to eager load is to use one property as a pass-through, but not actually retrieve the objects of that property. For example, I might want to see all of the book jacket designs for a particular author. I don't want the actual book information, but I have to go through books to get the jackets because book jackets is a property of books. My include expression could then navigate from author to books to book jackets. I won't dig more deeply into this, but I wanted to be sure you were familiar with these possibilities. Do be considerate of the possibility of creating performance issues if you really pile on the includes in a single query. I've had a number of clients reach out to me with performance issues that are caused exactly by this. There's another interesting point related to performance with includes. By default, as you've seen, EF-Core is creating a single SQL command from the query. In some cases, breaking the SQL down into multiple SQL commands sent to the database and then pulling all the data back together when it's returned might lead to a better performance option. To that point, there is a method to be aware of that you can use with include called as-split-query. The resulting data won't be any different, but the performance could be impacted. Again, it's another thing to keep in mind as you venture beyond the fundamentals. You may have already written query projections in earlier versions of EF, or if you write SQL queries, you've very likely used them, unless every single one of your queries is select star. In EF-Core, we can use query projections to shape the query that's sent to the database, which could very well include related data and the resulting objects. In EF-Core, we use link's select method to specify which properties of an object we want returned. If you're returning more than a single property, then you'll have to contain the new properties within a type. Link lets you do that even if what you're projecting doesn't match an existing type in your system, by using the new keyword and placing the list of properties in curly braces. This will return what's known in .NET as an anonymous type, but it will only be known to the method in which it's defined. Here I'm querying the authors, and in the link select method, I'm creating a new type that will return the author ID and a name that's a combination of the first initial of the author's first name and their last name. And the result is a list of anonymous types whose properties are an int and a string. If you need to move those anonymous types outside of the method, you could cast them to a list of dynamic, which is a feature of .NET languages. Or you can create another class or even a struct in your app and then project into that. Now let's add the books property into this projection. Before I move on, I do want to point out that Visual Studio is graying out the explicit property names for author ID and books. That's because .NET can get those directly from the properties, whereas the middle property, where I'm concatenating first and last name, does need an explicit property name. So I'll clean that up first. I'm now bringing back the complete books property. Now the anonymous type is made up of an integer, a string, and a list of books. You can also navigate into a related object without bringing back its complete types. As an example, I've changed the last property, which was books, to just be a count of the books. And check out the sequel. The count is part of the query, not something that happens in memory after the fact. So EF-Core is pretty clever with that. And in the results, now you can see I have an int, a string, and then another int that shows how many books there are. You can also do filters within a projection. So, for example, I'll do a filter on that books property. I'll append the where method on books to make sure that the query is only returning a count of books from the 1900s. That sounds so long ago, doesn't it? And notice that because my projection is a little more complicated now, the compiler told me that I needed to name it this time. Another really important point about this, the anonymous type itself can't be tracked because the context doesn't comprehend it. But if it has properties that are recognized entities, those will be tracked. So going back to the query that pulled back some properties from author and the author's books collection, let's run it again and check the debug view after the query is executed. All it knows about is the books, because those are known entities. The other properties in the type don't mean anything to the change tracker because they're not part of the data model. That is something really good to be aware of. Eager loading is great for querying graphs, but sometimes you already have an object in memory and want to get its related data. You can always use the same DB context instance to execute another query and let the change tracker take care of wiring up the related data. But there are two other ways to perform this task, which we refer to as loading. And EF Core's ways to do this are called explicit loading and lazy loading. One way is to do it explicitly through the context using the DB context entry method along with its load method. You can pass in the object that you already have in memory and then tell the context to load either a collection property such as books or a reference property. For example, if you have a book and you want to get its author. I'll start by retrieving an author into memory. And once it's in memory, I can use the context entry method, pass in that author object that I want to load from, then append the collection method along with a lambda for that author's books property, and finally I'll execute that with the load method. I'll stick a breakpoint in here so that I can look at the author before I load the books. And then I'll run it, and right now author has 0 books. But then after I call the load method, that same author now has 2 books attached. And there's the SQL command that the load method caused to get sent to the database. And once that book data came back, the change tracker started tracking it, and it made sure that those books got pushed into the books property of the author. Keep in mind that you can only call load on a single object, so you wouldn't be able to use it for a list of authors. In the case that you want to do that, the coding might be easier and the performance might even be better to just execute another LINQ query instead of iterating through that list and loading related data for each author. That's something you'd have to determine by profiling your code and checking performance. One last point I want to make sure you know about explicit loading is that you can filter collections using a query method, just like I'm doing in this example here.